Hi everybody and welcome to this short video. I'll be talking about colonization on the Northwest Coast and its impacts on coastal First Nations and their art. So I'd like to touch on 5 aspects of colonization, and those are smallpox epidemics and the drastic loss of life. Then I'm going to discuss the Potlatch Ban, museum collecting, and residential schools. And these last 3 processes are deliberate acts of assimilation and attempted genocide. So assimilation is the 5th topic I want to address. So after European contact in the late 18th century, the peoples who produced Northwest Coast art suffered a massive population decline due to diseases such as smallpox. Both indigenous oral historians and the work of demographers tell of a massive smallpox epidemic that had already reached the coast overland in the 1770s. During a number of gold rushes in the 1860s, there was an influx of people to the Northwest Coast. And at this time, Victoria grew from a town of about 500 people to over 30,000 in just a matter of months. The new arrivals bring a new wave of smallpox that caused another unimaginable loss of Indigenous lives. It is estimated that 90% of First Peoples of the continent had perished from diseases in the first 100 years of contact with Europeans. So it's nearly beyond comprehension to imagine what it would be like to lose 9 out of every 10 people. For oral societies, societies where knowledge and histories are kept and passed on orally, this was especially devastating. Haida scholar Barb Wilson captures the impact very well in this quote. She says, smallpox running through our people can be likened to a fire burning a library of 30,000 books. Our elders are our books of knowledge. As the art of the first peoples of this region is intimately interwoven with family, lineage, heredity, stories, songs, and ceremony, you can imagine how much knowledge of the arts and its transmission to future generations was impacted by these epidemics. Now, before I move into the Potlatch Ban, museum collecting, and residential schools, I want to quickly introduce the concept of assimilation. This is a key component of settler colonialism. It is based on the notion that one group of people are inherently inferior and thus they must be made to be more like the dominant society. So that is, assimilation is a process that is intended to ensure the disappearance of a group of people as a culturally distinct group. Following the founding and settlement of what we call Canada today, the federal government openly enacted a policy of assimilation towards Indigenous peoples with the goal of acquiring access to Indigenous lands and resources, and in order to reduce federal obligations that had been promised to Indigenous peoples. Forced assimilation into European and North American culture affected significant cultural losses for First Peoples through colonial suppression, cultural suppression, and the confiscation and destruction of traditional art and artifacts used in ceremony and governance. So due to these forces, production of the arts dropped drastically. An acute act of suppression on the Northwest Coast was something called the Potlatch Ban. With the massive loss of life from introduced diseases, many high-ranking titles had been left vacant. In accordance with the legal system, these roles can only be filled by potlatching. New sources of wealth from new economies, along with the loss of people, led to more lavish and frequent potlatches, and settlers saw this gifting as a waste and thought that people should be accumulating wealth for themselves and not gifting it away. So, government pressured by missionaries see the potlatch as a barrier to conversion and assimilation. And in 1884, the potlatch was outlawed. So, giving speeches, dancing, gift giving, and wearing regalia or ceremonial clothing becomes a criminal act for First Peoples. And this ban was not lifted until 1951, 67 years later. So, this is a photograph of some of the cultural belongings that were confiscated from Kwakwaka'wakw peoples who were caught potlatching in 1922. And these priceless family heirlooms were taken from their owners under the anti-potlatching laws and sold to Canadian and American museums. So museums themselves have deep roots in the colonial process, and during the late 19th and early 20th century, ethnographic museums were particularly active. Numerous belongings were sold under duress to these institutions and their agents, and many more were confiscated and stolen and put on display. At this time, anthropology, or the study of humans, as well as the museums where much of this work was taking place, was focused on an evolutionary paradigm, which was largely based on the ideas of Charles Darwin. So Darwin's ideas about natural selection get perverted into something we call social Darwinism, which is closely related to the notion of eugenics. People begin to assume that human society works the same as a natural system, like a forest. And this denies various racial and economic categories that humans project onto other humans. Essentially, it ignores culture. So it's understood that those who are the most fit to survive will naturally pass on their traits. Inequalities, the power of elites, economic and social differences all become justified as the natural order. So poverty, mental illness, intelligence, susceptibility to disease, criminality, these are all understood as the results of heredity and a good or bad gene pool. So therefore, societies that are judged to be more advanced are seen as superior, and those who are understood to be less advanced are destined to be replaced by those who are better adapted. So within this paradigm, indigenous peoples are seen as less adaptable and as a remnant of a previous era of human evolution, and they're seen as being forced towards extinction by more developed or adaptable societies. That is, Victorians or modern Europeans or modern Americans. So, just to be clear, this is a perversion of Darwin's scientific theory to validate notions of racial superiority. It is false, and it has widely been disproven. But based on these theories, in the early 20th century, there was a common assumption that indigenous peoples were disappearing as a natural course of human evolution. So anthropologists began working to quote unquote save what they could from these vanishing societies for the edification of future generations. These ideas, in tandem with policies like the Potlatch Ban, lead to something called the Great Age of Ethnographic Collecting. Great, I guess, if you're a collector. And further confiscation of Indigenous peoples' material belongings as well as their physical bodies. As it was thought at the time, skeletal analysis could prove racial superiority or inferiority. Therefore, along with material belongings and art objects, human remains were often stolen and taken and sold and bought and put into museums. So from roughly 1875 to the Great Depression, the age of ethnographic collecting is described as really a scramble for skulls and skeletons, poles, canoes, baskets, feast bowls, you name it. This went on until everything not nailed down or hidden was removed from Indigenous communities. So the last assimilative pressure that I want to talk about is the residential school system, which according to the United Nations Convention on Genocide was an act of genocide. I'm sure many of you have some knowledge of this topic, so I will be brief. These schools were officially run by the federal government and Christian denominations between the 1880s and 1996, and over 150,000 children were forcibly taken from their homes and put in the care of the state. The schools were expressly designed to assimilate Indigenous children into mainstream white Canadian society, that is, to erase their indigeneity. The goal was to sever ties with parents and grandparents in order to prevent Indigenous children from learning and thus perpetuating their languages, cultures, and knowledge. So I just want to point out that the residential schools, the Potlatch Ban, and museum collecting are not separate occurrences. Simpson anthropologist Robin Gray points this out when she says, in Canada, the history of capturing Indigenous children and the history of capturing Indigenous cultural heritage are intimately connected. The residential school system was merely part of a larger set of relations that denied Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing in order to justify the exploitation of Indigenous property and systems of property ownership. At the same time as Indigenous children were being taken away to the 18 residential schools across British Columbia, the Potlatch Ban outlawed feasting and ceremony and all the artistic production that goes along with it. Paradoxically, as Indigenous people were banned from owning and using their cultural expressions, settler society and provincial and federal governments confiscated this material, placed it in museums, and promoted it as Canadian heritage and as symbols of a long lost Indigenous past.